Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel and welcome to my January wrap-up. I wanted to talk about all the books I've read in January, and this is actually the second time I'm filming this. My original file got corrupted or something because when I went to edit it, it kept telling me that one of the frames was not findable or something. I don't understand what was wrong there, but I tried a few different fixes. It didn't work, so we're trying this again. As a result, though, I can't actually hold up the books because I filmed that and then packed those books. As you can see, I've been packing up everything. And between packing and streaming on Twitch, which I've just started doing, I've been reading a lot less. So that's why I also only read 2 books this month. That said, I ended up giving both books I read the same rating of 3.5 stars, which I thought was an interesting outcome because I went into them with very different expectations. The first book I read this month was Misery by Stephen King. And I went into this one with fairly low expectations. My previous experience with King was that I had read It a couple of years ago, and then I asked one of my coworkers recently for some recommendations because I found out that he loves Stephen King, and he suggested that Misery might be a good place to go next. And I think that this was a good call because I enjoyed this one a lot more than I enjoyed It. I was actually pleasantly surprised. I had a good time with this one. I think it's a really interesting story. We're following Paul Sheldon, who is a writer, and he ends up getting in a car accident and wakes up in the house of his #1 fan, Annie Wilkes, who is a former nurse who is taking care of him, but also trying to force him to write the next book in her favorite series. So it's following this kind of tense situation between the two of them as they're progressing through time as he's writing this book and as she is like taking care of him but also kind of torturing him. There's a lot going on there and it goes in some directions that I wasn't expecting. Some of the things I ended up really loving in this were I really enjoyed the discussions that this brought up about like the experience of being a writer and especially like writing for a living, as well as the experience of being a writer interacting with a fandom and how fans feel about your work and how fans feel entitled to certain elements of your work. I thought that was a really interesting discussion and I appreciated the way that that was tackled. And I also really liked a lot of the writing in this, more than I expected. I think there's some really strong imagery in here that stuck out to me. Like in particular, there's a piece of imagery very early on in the book where Paul kind of explains the pain that he's experiencing as reminding him of these metal pilings he remembers seeing at the beach as a kid. So you remember seeing these pilings that the tide would come in and cover them, and then the tide would go out and the pilings would still be there. And so they almost seemed like more eternal to him than the ocean did. And he starts to describe his pain as being like the pilings, with the tide being the pain medication he's being given. I thought that was just a really interesting description of the pain that he was experiencing and a really like evocative one. And there were a few other kind of instances of images like that that kind of stuck throughout the book that I thought were interesting. And I also really liked how much that started to play into the novel that he's writing, because in the book we are actually getting sections of the novel as he's working on it, and there were these like little elements of his experiences, like things will happen between him and Annie Wilkes, or he'll like experience something while he's there, and bits and pieces of that will start to bleed into the novel that he's writing. And I really enjoyed seeing how there was that interplay between the story of Paul and the story that Paul was working on. There were also these moments where the writing would become almost like frantic, where it would feel like the paragraphs were like interrupting each other because there was so much going on, and it was usually in a moment of something really intense happening or some point where Paul was trying to do something kind of against the clock and he would have to do something very quickly, or he'd be like watching something almost happen in slow motion, but we'd get these frantic paragraphs that are interrupting each other, and he would have like an internal narrator that was talking, and just like this really chaotic blend of words that worked really well at at illustrating the kind of panic that Paul was feeling in all of those like different moments. So I really enjoyed those pieces of it, and I think it was a really good story. I think this book, more so than It, convinced me that Stephen King is a really good storyteller, which is usually the thing that I hear from people who really like his work about him, is that they'd say he's a really good storyteller. The things that didn't work for me as well here was that the first half of the book felt kind of monotone to me. There's no real build up to Annie Wilkes being terrible. He starts out with like page 3, Annie Wilkes is ugly and mean and obviously there's something wrong with her. And I feel like that made the first half of the book feel kind of tensionless because it was just the same level of horror all the way through. The latter half started to get more interesting because we had more pieces happening. There were more mysteries going on. There were conclusions to some mysteries introduced in the beginning that were being provided. And there was a lot more like movement with other people coming and going through the story than there had been in the first half. So I really liked the second half better than the first half, and it was just like a little monotone for me. I think it's kind of the same criticism I had of Killing Stalking, where it's just like horrible stuff happening constantly with no real ups and downs of emotion in between. The other thing I had issue with was some of the topics that it used as reasons or images. So like there's a few times when something is described as being like a kind of rape, and I just usually don't like that kind of imagery. I don't think it's useful, and I also think it's kind of insensitive, especially the way it was used in this book. And then also that the villain is pretty much directly diagnosed as bipolar by Paul, who is not a specialist. Obviously, he's an author. I have a lot of issues with villains being given specific mental disorders because there was already so much stigma around mental health that I feel like it's something we have to be really careful with in our writing, but also in understanding those stigmas and kind of peeling back those layers when we're reading something that's using a specific kind of mental disorder or mental health topic as part of its themes or part of its story. And I just have issues with the way that that was presented here. I don't have anything to say about whether it was accurate or not. I do not have bipolar disorder, so I would, encourage you to look for reviews from people who are, are open about that and maybe are like advocates for mental health. I feel like they would be able to give you a better sense of how this is presented. I just think that it's unfortunate to give a villain a specific mental disorder because there is so much stigma around disorders like bipolar disorder already. So those were kind of my major issues with the book, but overall I still had an enjoyable time with it. I thought it was interesting. It did take me a while to get through just because that first half was kind of monotone for me, but I did in the end enjoy it enough that I think I would pick up something else from Stephen King at this point. So I would like to go back and read some more of his work at a later date. The other book I read this month was Uncanny by Junji Ito, and I came at this with the kind of opposite expectation. I've read and loved some of his other work, so I was really excited for Uncanny, and I think parts of it fell a little flat for me. It was just kind of a weird structure overall, and I feel like some of the chapters just needed a little more development to have more impact. The first two chapters kind of focus on his childhood up through when he became a manga artist, with the first chapter being kind of non-linear and jumping around to look at different media that he had engaged with as a child and look at like why did he like it as a kid, but also now as an adult looking back, what are the things that he appreciates artistically about those particular movies and manga and TV shows, etc. And that kind of got confusing because it was kind of jumping back and forth between things. And I also noticed that chapter 1 would give you kind of long explanations on things that I felt like were slightly more common knowledge, and then not give any explanation at all on other things that I had no idea what they were and had to look them up. So I feel like some of the choices there were a little odd in terms of what to explain and what not to explain, although that might be more of a like cultural difference thing because some of the stuff that he explained more were like Western movies and TV shows, and so they were more familiar to me as a Western audience, but maybe not so much for his Japanese audience. Like I don't know. For me, it was a little confusing because it was like, yeah, no, I know about I think it was like Ray Harryhausen, the animator, I think is mentioned. There's a specific animator I recognize who's mentioned, and it goes into quite a bit of detail about like what claymation is and like how it's done. And I was like, no, I know this. But then later on it mentions a French comic art movement that I had never heard of. And I was like, what is this? What does that mean? Why is this important? So some of those choices I just thought were a little odd. Chapter 2 is my favorite. I think that's the strongest, and if it had kind of followed the trajectory of chapter 2, I think I would have found the whole thing a little bit stronger. Chapter 2 is really looking at from his kind of young adulthood when he's getting out of school and going into a trade school to, I think he became a dental technician, I believe is the job title, but basically he was like making fake teeth, which is kind of funny and cool. That chapter starts there and then travels through to look at the trajectory from that point and being a dental technician up to how he got involved in manga art and how he made that a full-time career path, how that happened and worked out for him. So I found that was really interesting, and I liked the way that he discussed the like factors that went into making that a viable possibility for him, and the the support of his family and like all these other pieces. I thought that was just really well written and really engaging in finding out like how did he get to this point. The last 3 chapters were all examinations of specific pieces of his work, specific stories. Through, I think chapter 3 is story and plot, chapter 4 is characters, and chapter 5 is specific images and like how he makes those impactful images in his work. And I thought that those chapters were a little bit overly long and offered too many examples. And in chapter 3 we got too much analysis, but in chapters 4 and 5 I feel like we didn't get enough analysis of those points, and the general comments on each of those chapters came at the end instead of the beginning. So I feel like those chapters would have been stronger if they'd started with some general comments of like, here's some ideas I want to explore through my examples, and then looked at the examples and provided analysis on them. I think 3 was the longest feeling chapter. It was the one where I felt like it just kept going on and on and on, and it was reaching a point where I was like skipping through to be like, how many pages do I have left until I get to chapter 4, which I hate feeling like that when I'm reading something, but I was getting a little bit tired of reading these very specific bits of information about different stories. The other thing was a formatting thing, which is that the 3, 4, and 5 chapters have copies of some of his notes from each of the stories he's discussing, and for all of those they've put translations of what he's written on the page in the margins, but they've done it in this like really tiny white text that's really hard to read, and there's a ton of it. So I feel like the formatting there was kind of a problem. I think that text needed to be just a little bit bigger to make it easier to read, because it was really interesting to see like what he had written on those pages and how he had like developed the story from those notes. It was just really hard to read the information there because it was so small. So all of that aside, I think the big takeaways that I got from this that I thought were really interesting was just like the process of how he creates a manga. It was kind of a learning aspect for me of just going like, what is that process like? What is the creation and editing process like? And I liked his exploration of that and like how he goes like step by step, how he comes up with an idea, how he starts to storyboard it, like all of those pieces. I thought that was really cool. And then he also talks a lot, which surprised me, about regrets with the stories. Like there were specific stories he'd say, oh, I regretted how this one turned out because I feel like I let somebody else talk me into an ending that I don't love, or I regret how this turned out because I just didn't have enough time to put the ending that I wanted. And I thought that was interesting, like how frequently he talks about having specific regrets about specific stories. And the other thing I thought was interesting too in the later parts is he talks a little bit more about how aging has impacted his work process, both through like the advancement of technology, that there's new technology that he now uses that makes certain things easier for him to do. So it's created this like change in his art over time, but also that aging has created this timeline issue for him where it takes him more time. He doesn't have the same kind of drawing stamina he had when he was younger, so it takes him longer to do the artwork for each story, but he has this like kind of 1 month time frame for most stories where he's like coming up with the idea at the beginning of that month and having to have that draft done at the end of the month, and that is becoming like increasingly difficult just because age-wise he's having more trouble doing the kind of like long drawing sessions that he did when he was younger. So I thought that was really interesting and I appreciated those insights from him. Also in the first 2 chapters, even though I didn't love like the format of the first chapter, there's just lots of little fun details about him that are sprinkled throughout that I thought were just delightful. Like there's a whole thing about how he was really into skating for a while, like roller skating, and it was so fun. It was like neat seeing the things that he appreciated as a kid and the kinds of activities he got into, and it just really highlights how much of a normal person he is, and I thought that was just a fun aspect of the book as a whole. So yeah, I enjoyed both of these. I feel like the 3.5 feels very different for both of them because I came at them with very different expectations, but despite it being a fairly limited reading month and only 3.5 stars, I still feel like it was a pretty solid start to the year, and I'm hoping that February will be better, although I'm actually moving in February, which is why there's no books on any of the shelves, so I'm gonna be mostly reading ebooks through February, April. So we'll see how everything goes. So that's all I read in January. Let me know down in the comments below what you read in January, and especially what your favorite book you read in January was. I always like knowing what people are enjoying reading lately. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, I hope you consider giving it a like, maybe even subscribing to see what comes next. I'm currently posting on Tuesdays and Saturdays, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.